Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here with the second half of the Iron Kingdoms era and its rough overlap with the modern era. Finding a suitable demarcation point was a bit of a pain given the way the narrative flows, but also because of the identity that I've given the narrator for these presentations. Even so, it was cleanest to separate the historic periods from the start of the game's story beginnings with the coronation of King Leto in 594 AR, even though this won't be explicitly alluded to because of the narrator's biases. Confirming to said biases, however, the second cut-off point is Vale Halir's betrayal of the Nis in 605 AR, so that the full narrative of the Warmachine Hordes storyline can be kicked off simultaneously in the next installment of the series. I expect this to be fairly lengthy, so I won't spend any longer on this intro. To first address simple matters for this era as far as record keeping is concerned, the Caen had remained comparatively inactive as far as their standards are concerned. Though conflict persisted at a low level throughout the centuries, the great houses of the Caen realms and the Mercenary Lake maintained their tradition of political jostling, though little change in terms of overall dynamic. The potential for change originated in the development of a volatile gas called Venhocar. Caen chemists treated it as something of a novelty for several years before a military engineer saw use for it and invented the Reaver, a conical firearm that projects metal needles at high velocity and rate of fire. The missiles propelled by release of Venhocar gas held under pressure in specially designed canisters. Wishing to capitalize on this invention, economically at first and then militarily, House Luchon, the engineer's patron house, stockpiled Reavers in secret, but was discovered before sufficient numbers could be produced. As a lesser house, Luchon was compelled to submit to House Jakar and give up the knowledge of Reaver technology. The other great houses, whether by subterfuge or by intimidation, would come to obtain the technology in due course, and one of its first widespread uses came with the bloody conquests of Varktash of House Balash, who brought much of the territory around Lake Mirketh under the direct control of his house. His death threatened to destabilize the empire that he had created, thanks to the alleged poisoning of his son by Akkad, Varktash's grandson. This allegation led to the civil war of House Balash, which saw Akkad's younger sister, Makedo, defeat him in a duel and inherit her grandfather's legacy. Across the Blackstone Desert, to the north, as if Ios had not already suffered enough, despite not involving itself in the wars of others or interfering in the affairs of their neighbours, this era would prove to be a difficult time for the elves, whether Iosen or Nis. No one can say when with any measure of certainty, but the dragon Ethran Baal burrowed his way beneath Isira. The effects of his blight and draconic manipulation of the people were eventually discovered and brought to the attention of Narcissa Lycia of House Saivas in 4356. The subsequent mobilization of Houseguard troops along with the arrival of a detachment from House Rislir forced Ethran Baal's hand, and he unleashed his dragon spawn upon Aisla's city. What ensued was its destruction as a titanic city-wide battle took place, and though the dragon was defeated, it came at the cost of Isira itself, and much of its populace. It was no victory for Iosant, who, loath to keep an Athank within its borders, had it spirited north into the wilderness of the northern mountains. But this was not the end of Ethran Baal, and once again he waited and studied. Having gained knowledge of how to influence Iosans, he easily adapted his methods to controlling the Nis. He needed but the faintest nudge to convince Vale Halir, an ambitious and treacherous sorceress, to turn on her own people, and the latest iteration of Ethran Baal's Legion came about with her willing cooperation, which spelled doom for all but the most fortunate and most quick-minded Nis, as the Winter Elves would soon be consumed by blight. Within the borders of Ios, matters were barely better. Despite being outlawed, both the Retribution of Syra and the Seekers looked to further their goals, much to the disapproval of the Consulate's court, who did their best to ignore their actions. Despite this, a small number of nobles were sympathetic to the motivations of these two organizations. However, one Narcissa Gearshield of House Vire soon came to prominence. A passionate, charismatic and ambitious arcanist, he shared the Retribution's belief that the Consulate Court was not doing enough to ease the plight of either Syra or the Iosan people as a whole. However, his somewhat times erratic temper and apparent bloodthirstiness led to the War of the Great Houses and the isolation of Ios from the rest of Immoren. It is a little poignant that Colossals, last seen when Woljud decommissioned them, marched to war once more 300 years later, built by artificers of House Shail. They would help swing the war in the Allies' favour, and through Gorshade's eventual defeat, no one in Ios could deny the ineffectiveness of the Consulate Court at this time. Within a generation, many Halatir would openly support, whether morally or materially, the retribution of Syra. Only time would tell if it would be of any benefit to the future of the Elven race, though. In the West, in addition to cultural and technological advancements, the Quiet Century was known in the human world for the revival of the mercenary traditions. Even though the armed forces of Cignar and Cador did not face each other directly, their governments paid various companies of sellswords to fight their wars for them. These proxy wars resulted in few real changes in terms of territorial control or spheres of influence, but served as strategic skirmishes in which one side attempted to compel a response in the other, with minimal investment. While Ord and Lael did not have the resources available to engage in such power plays in the manner of their stronger neighbours, they nonetheless participated in them, if to a more limited extent. Not only did these wars, if they can be termed wars, preserve a nation's true military strength, but it was the perfect testing environment for the aforementioned technological developments, which included man-of-war armour, arcnodes, and updated warjack armaments. And even through conventional wars, use of mercenaries would continue. But all things must come to an end, and a cannonade between the fleets of Cador and Ord marked the beginning of Cador's second expansion war. Using Ordic negligence in the policing of the Immore's western coastline as an excuse, King Mikhail Vanar launched an amphibious invasion against his southern neighbour and surprised his enemy by assaulting Corban. A very focused war that occurred entirely in and around Corban, Cador were repulsed from Ord after 2 years of bitter fighting by an Ordic-Cignarian alliance, undone more by their tenuous logistics and the inexperience of their navy. Notably, mercenary outfits from throughout the Iron Kingdoms were extensively employed by both sides, which historians note contributed to the length and severity of the war. To the south, the flagrant disregard for Waldred's accord-by-hand covenant, displayed by his successor Malagant, was remembered by the leadership of the Cignarian Church of Menoth, as well as the unbridled ambition of the Morrowind priesthood. Though the Menite priesthood's role in legitimizing the Cignarian throne succession was restored in the reign of future monarchs, the relationship shared among the crown and the two rival churches was strained at best, often spilling over into sporadic civil disorder, sometimes resulting in localized sectarian violence. This would eventually come to a head when Solon, a particularly zealous firebrand among the Menite clergy, issued a summons for all faithful to descend upon Caspia, where he delivered a powerful sermon and led the gathered worshippers in expressing their contempt for Morrowind influence on Cignar's leadership. The congregation was confronted by Cignarian regular forces, and scuffles quickly escalated into violence. This marked the beginning of the Cignarian Civil War that saw militias from the Menite minority occupy Caspia on the eastern bank of the Black River. 2 years of fierce fighting saw a stalemate that was only broken with the death of Solon in battle. But the Cignarian leadership had little desire to continue the war and agreed terms that would split Cignar into two, with all its territory east of Caspia becoming the new protectorate of Menoth. The eastern part of Caspia itself was renamed Sul in honour of the father of the protectorate, becoming the new nation's first capital. His people at first would be known as the Sulis, but became Sul Menites to reflect the first hierarch's teachings, but also his place at their god's feet. Tensions between Cignar and the protectorate remained, no matter who was on the Cignarian throne. Despite the difficult beginnings for the protectorate, they soon came to flourish in the harsh lands in the south, including reclaiming ancient Ixthia, vassalizing the Idrian tribes that dwelled within the region, and even making technological developments of their own. Wars continued aplenty, including the Coin War, a sideshow to the Cignarian Civil War which saw an abortive Cadoran invasion of Lael that was rebuffed by mercenary forces in Laeli's pay. Unfortunately, it left that smaller nation destitute to the point it had to downsize its standing army, forever weakening it due in no small part to a reliance on Cignarian support that only grew over the generations. Cador and Cignarian enmity would also be further renewed in the First Thornwood War, when the Mad King Vigor tricked his southern counterpart, Grigor, into sending his forces to aid Laeli's border garrisons, while his actual army, with a large component of warjacks in a newly reorganized Cadoran army, drove through the Thornwood. A hastily assembled militia succeeded in halting the Cadoran advance, and the Mad King was killed in the biggest battle involving warjacks in history to date. The aftermath of this war brought the Iron Kingdoms into what humans, perhaps optimistically, called the Modern Era, characterized by the establishment of stability among the ruling institutions, a rapidly evolving social dynamic, and the swift spread of industrialization. Vigor's death at the Battle of the Tongue ultimately resulted in 2 dynastic changes. In Cador, he was replaced by the Vanars, who had previously ruled during the latter part of the Quiet Century and beyond, if with questionable success, for Joseph was as ineffectual as Mikhail was ambitious, despite lifelong ill health. The dynasty returned thanks to Vigor's widow, Ain VIII, who abdicated in favour of her son-in-law, Sagriv II, who in turn was succeeded by son Ivard, whose rule was as long as it was prosperous for Cador. And in Cignar, King Grigor saw fit to declare Vigor's vanquisher, Vinter Raelthorn II, his successor, who would go on to rule using his archducal name. And while the Protectorate, young as it was, possessed no ruling house, he had in its place the office of hierarch, and they considered themselves blessed to have strong and charismatic leaders who each strengthened this fledgling state on a hostile diplomatic stage. Similarly, in Lael and Ord, though the Martins and Cathors, respectively, were established dynasties, the beginning of the modern era saw a measure of stability in internal politics. Indeed, Ordic politics was every bit as cutthroat as in Lael, if in a more brazen way, and the Cathors had deadly competition for the throne in the Mater family, and their rivalry was what eventually led to the War of the Castellans in the early 420s. And though the Cathors emerged victorious, their grip on power remained tenuous for several generations, no thanks to infighting amongst the various branches of the Cathal family itself, until Alvor IV took the throne, and whose reign finally saw the decline of his dynastic enemies, the Maters. Lael was ultimately not so fortunate as the modern era progressed. Though the nation was relatively stable leading into this period of time, it was still the start of what historians now call its long decline. The monarchy grew progressively weaker as they became subject to the whims of the Council of Nobles, and such ventures as the Coin War and the Laelese front of the First Thornwood War did little to improve the Crown's authority in Laelese government. This came to a head, and in sudden circumstances, with the death of King Renard. Though popular and effective in his rule, and despite having returned a measure of power to the office of the crown, he died in suspicious circumstances, and he had no clear or obvious heir. Competing factions within the Council of Nobles forwarded preferred heirs and killed those of other parties, forcing the legitimate branches of the Martin family into hiding. This led to Dear Glabrin effectively seizing control, declaring him first Prime Minister and then Regent until a suitable heir could be found, though in reality he had little intention of relinquishing power. Little did he know, and some even alleged that he was involved in its execution, but the now kingless kingdom was about to be thrown into fresh turmoil by its northwestern neighbour. Cador, meanwhile, continued to patiently develop and improve their standing in spite of any foreign criticism. But by contrast, Cignar regressed with the successive reigns of Vinters III and IV. The third of that name was a petty leader, known for taxing his nation almost excessively, and while he did leave Cignar's economy and armed forces in a strong state, he was nonetheless an unpopular king. Vinzer IV, however, was almost universally reviled by the common citizen for his tyrannical rule and heretic edicts, characterized by paranoid persecution undertaken by the short-lived Inquisition, and his irrationally myopic attitude towards the Church of Morrow. Not that his disposition towards the Mennonite minority was any better. The so-called witch trials, instigated by the Inquisition at the king's behest, are now considered a low point in the record and history of Cignar's judicial system, as many of the convicted were, even at the time, provably innocent. Thus, for the early part of his reign, Vinter's main saving grace was the popularity of his younger brother, Leto, with whom the king shared military plaudits during the many wars fought at this time. One such war was the result of a storm that was brewing out towards the Wailing Sea. After some hundreds of years, the Dragonfather and his minions, the Lich Lords, finally made their move against the Immoren's mainland. But they had not been idle in this intervening time since the Orgoth's defeat. What they took from Dredrakeren, they studied, broke down, reassembled, and mastered. Though already given to foul magics that living Immoren would regard with contempt and fear, what the Orgoth left behind only amplified their power. Thus it was that in 584 AR, a tide of black-sailed ships from the Crixian archipelago heralded the beginning of the Shard invasions, marking the beginning of a series of increasingly complex and brutal Crixian incursions into predominantly Cignarian territory. Even though the first invasion was eventually driven back after 4 years by forces under the joint command of King Vinter and his brother Prince Leto, the Cignarians did not forget the king's tyranny. The oppression felt by his citizens was such that Vinter eventually lost even the support of his brother, who was among his staunchest allies during the early years of his reign. And in 594, the king was tried by the royal court in absentia and ultimately deposed after another brief civil war known as the Lion's Coup. But, with yet another build-up of force in Cador poised to attack Lael, the Crixian menace growing ever more threatening, the Protectorate wishing to settle ancient grievances with more zeal than ever before, the exodus of those Nis that remained who brought with them their most sacred artifact, and an exiled Vinter Raelthorn who planned his bloody vengeance. It would not take much to render this modern era little more than a time when all Immoren would become a battlefield.